Now we're going to talk about who helps the president out. What positions support him? Because the executive branch is a lot bigger than just the president, even though the president's the only position we elect. Remember, the vice president is a package deal. So the president and vice president lead the executive branch. However, we've had a lot of vice presidents that actually didn't get along with the presidents at all. A lot of times a party have pushed for either a more conservative or more progressive vice president than the president necessarily wanted. And we've had presidents and vice presidents get along. However, in the case of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, they seem to get along pretty well. And they kind of complement each other. She's maybe a little bit more progressive than he is. But you think of President Trump, Mike Pence was very conservative, while Donald Trump was much more of like an opportunist and a populist president. And that's why a lot of people put Republicans wanted Mike Pence to maybe cool down Donald Trump. And we didn't really see that happen until the very end. They seem to get along okay, but I'm not sure that Mike Pence was the most powerful person in his cabinet at all. He just got along with them. So you could see that, and you just think back to Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson's a Southerner, very sympathetic to the South after the Civil War, where actually Abraham Lincoln became more and more aggressive towards giving consequences and wanting the South justice for slaves. He became much more progressive in his point of view as time went on, and he actually saw the slaves freed. So we've had a lot of conflict between those positions. And generally, vice presidents are pretty much a ceremonial position. With Kamala Harris, that's not the case, at least for the first 2 years, because she will be the tiebreaker in the Senate. And probably one of the most powerful vice presidents was Dick Cheney under George W. Bush. He had a lot to do with the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and how things went, and had a lot of influence over the power and companies, and was seen as by some as maybe one of the most, if not the most powerful vice president we've known. We'll see. We'll see as history goes on, who will be the most powerful vice president ever. It's also a good position to help you get elected as president if that's what you're choosing to do next. Now, the cabinet are the ones in charge of the actual departments under the executive branch, the bureaucracies. These bureaus that have experts in them, they're supposed to have experts in them that to actually execute things. So, for example, Miguel Cardona is now in charge of the education department. He's education secretary, and he's actually an expert. He was in charge of the school districts in the state of Connecticut. He took a very strong stance on going virtual under the pandemic, and against a very unpopular, that was not necessarily the most popular choice. However, he chose to be safe over sorry was his approach. And Joe Biden respect that and put him in his cabinet. And that was one of the reasons. You have at the top, you have Anthony Blinken, who's probably the third most powerful person in government. Sometimes Secretary of States are the second most powerful person in the executive branch. Really, the Secretary of State, it's usually a president, Secretary of State. So that's why you remember if Barack Obama gave Hillary Clinton the Secretary of State position, that was a very big deal. They give the person he ran against, this really powerful position. And they represent us to all foreign nations, and they're basically the communications are representative of America to all other foreign countries. They're very powerful and very influential in foreign affairs. You got things like Department of Education, which, trains, you think of trafficking, bridges, infrastructure, very important. And the newest department, what do you guys think is the newest department? Think what's been added. And I guess it's not that new anymore, but when I started teaching, it was pretty new. It is the Department of Homeland Security, and that was actually added under George W. Bush after the attacks on 9/11. So their job is to protect us from terrorism and keep the country safe from foreign attacks and keep us secure. So now we have 15 cabinets when we had 14, and that number has gone up and shows the government's actually expanding instead of shrinking. And you have to remember, with President Trump was in office, he put a lot of unqualified people maybe in charge of these departments, are people from the private sector, which made sense to him because Republicans generally don't like bureaucracy. They want to cut down on anything government run, and they want to give it to the private sector. And we'll find that with the parties. And that's not the case in this case, where Joe Biden went for experts. And you can see his cabinet is actually incredibly diverse, where President Trump's was not very diverse at all. It was almost all white men. I think one Asian one was actually Mitch McConnell's wife. But there wasn't very much diversity at all. And this says Latinx, African American women and men. It has white men. It has white women. It's very diverse. Indigenous American, the first Indigenous American woman. She's actually in charge of the lands for the United States. You think about how important that is. You could see all the diversity in there. So Interior Secretary, that's Representative Deb Haaland. She is actually Indigenous American from New Mexico. So she's going to be in charge of protecting interior lands of the United States. She'll be interesting to see how she approaches this. So we'll see. Is this going to work? So we're watching a real quick video. Really gives us some great information on presidents in the past through hip hop, which I love.
Washington is called the father of the nation. John Adams passed treachery legislation. The famous Thomas Jefferson bought Louisiana. Under James Madison, War of 1812 began. And the Monroe Doctrine was by James Monroe. John Quincy Adams built canals that flow. Know that Andrew Jackson led the common man's cause. Martin Van Buren shunned war at all costs. Lost William Harrison, he died in bed. So then John Tyler filled in instead. Presidents, whom have we picked to be presidents? Let's see, throughout America's history, who's made it into the presidency? James Polk was an underdog, first dark horse. Zachary Taylor elected cause he fought in wars. California admitted by Millard Fillmore. Franklin Pierce on a law book, his oath he swore. Moreover, James Buchanan saw the state seceding. Abraham Lincoln brought slaves to freedom. Believe Andrew Johnson bought Alaskan land. Ulysses Grant granted votes to every last good man. Disbanded post-war Reconstruction Rutherford Hayes. James Garfield assassinated after 90 days. Presidents, whom have we picked to be presidents? Let's see, throughout America's history, who's made it into the presidency? The song continues on. Did you think that it was over? Chester Arthur, Postal Service bribery he smoldered. Grover Cleveland vetoed more bills than most. Benjamin Harrison narrowly won his vote. Throw a toast to Grover, he gained victory again. William McKinley killed by a gunman. One friend of the environment was Teddy Roosevelt. William Taft, income tax what he most developed. Hope to build the League of Nations, that was Woodrow Wilson. Warren Harding had a cabinet that Skidle spilled from. Presidents, whom have we picked to be presidents? Let's see, throughout America's history, who's made it into the presidency? Calvin Coolidge wiped away the nation's debt. But then came depression, much to Herbert Hoover's threat. Yet Franklin Roosevelt, new jobs he created. Harry Truman's usage of the bomb was much debated. An interstate highway system made by Dwight Eisenhower. John Kennedy defied Soviet missile power. For our Civil Rights Act, we can thank Lyndon Johnson. Richard Nixon resigned to Watergate involvement. On to Gerald Ford, the appointee to replace him. Jimmy Carter pardoned those accused of draft evasion. Presidents, whom have we picked to be presidents? Let's see, throughout America's history, who's made it into the presidency? When Ronald Reagan spoke, he restored the nation's pride. George H. Bush in the Gulf War, he thrived. To the sky under Bill Clinton surged the economy. George W. Bush formed Homeland Security. You see, Barack Obama wants change to come along, but maybe one day it'll be your name in the song. Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Adams, Jackson, Van Buren, Harrison, Tyler, then Pope. Taylor, Fillmore, Pierce, Buchanan, Lincoln, Johnson, Grant, Hayes, Garfield, Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, Cleveland, McKinley, Roosevelt, Taft, Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, Hoover, Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, and then Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. Presidents, whom have we picked to be presidents? Let's see, throughout America's history, who's made it into the presidency? Presidents, whom have we picked to be presidents? Let's see, throughout America's history, who's made it into the presidency? Presidents, whom have we picked to be presidents? Presidents, whom have we picked to be presidents? Presidents, whom have we picked to be presidents?
So you could see that was really cool. They went through all the presidents listed, but obviously the song hadn't gotten to Donald Trump and now Joe Biden. So let's look at this one. The responsibilities of Secretary of State are most likely to overlap with those of, so if they're a Secretary of State and they're political overseas, is it the Secretary of Interior? Okay, and she said she's in charge of the land and inside what's happening and preserving like national parks. Secretary of Treasury, it has to do with the money. That's Janet Yellen, who was actually the head of the Federal Reserve. She was replaced by Donald Trump by Jerome Powell. He had Jerome Powell, which was a Wall Street banker, basically a guy in charge of stock exchange. She was actually an expert economist from Yale. So it tells you that Joe Biden really wants experts back in these cabinets. Speaker of the House, who's the most powerful person in the House, the president's chief of staff, the person who's kind of in charge of really talking to the president and really close and his closest staff members to him, or the chief and national security advisor to the president. So who do you think where they really overlap? So of course it would be the chief and national security advisor to the president, because they're going to our foreign issues under the Secretary of State and working deals and mutual agreements with other nations. And then on the other side, the National Chief of Staff advises the president on how to keep the nation safe. All right, so we can see here's a picture, a better picture. It kind of shows you some of the cabinet members. And again, we said the Secretary of State would probably be the most powerful, but this is actually his senior staff. And the White House staff are really important, really important. So Anthony Brunel is probably his most trusted advisor. Like the White House staff, they run around, they do whatever Joe Biden needs. They're the ones that are going to do what he needs. And even his White House staff seems to be pretty diverse. The president's most trusted advisors, they have to help the president, are the White House staff. They're not cabinet members. That's also another thing. So they don't have to necessarily be approved by the Senate under advise and consent. Very important. He just chooses them. He can pretty much have whoever he wants for White House chief of staff. So a lot of these people ran his campaign, or he's known, since he's been in politics, or they're just really close friends with him that he could trust above all. So they tend to trust and listen to their White House staff, sometimes more than their cabinets. So they're very important. These are the guys that run around the building all day long doing whatever he needs, communicating with the Veep. Remember, he's the POTUS. The Veep would be the vice president. All right. So let's talk about another power the executive branch has. They have what's called executive privilege. And executive privilege is this constitutional principle that permits the president and high-level executive branch officers to withhold information from Congress, the courts, and ultimately the public. So you have to think logically, what would be a logical reason that the president would have executive privilege? And of course, it would be things like top secret documents or things that he doesn't want to get out to the newspaper, things that could jeopardize the safety of soldiers or the logistics of the pandemic, or could open us up to a domestic or foreign terrorist attack. Things like that are things that the public is not ready to know kind of thing. However, one really failed example is Richard Nixon. As you can see in the picture, he tried to use executive privilege to cover up Watergate. And you can see that there's the Watergate cartoon, where the Constitution is above the Watergate, above any office. This is the idea of rule of law, where he tried to use executive privilege to withhold tapes from the White House of him talking and showing pure evidence, straightforward evidence, that he had committed a crime, that he'd actually been a part of Watergate. And the Supreme Court's shouldn't be standing up on that. That's not what the Constitution allows executive privilege for. Again, it's to keep safety of the citizens first and foremost. It's not to protect president's issues. And we've had president issues. We've had a lot of executive privileges waived under President Trump. He used it a lot. And a lot of times it was shut down. Other times it upheld by the Supreme Court. So it's seen as a power that you have to make, the president has to make a real argument that, hey, this is for the safety of the nation. I can't just give you this information. And the other issue is the First Amendment, and the press should have access to information as long as it doesn't jeopardize safety. Okay, so let's read this one, and then we're going to answer these questions. So the principles of president executive privilege was limited by the Supreme Court ruling in U.S. versus Nixon in 1974 and resulted in an eventual resignation of President Nixon because he didn't get this. It didn't work. Which of the following is an accurate statement explaining the ruling? Did the Supreme Court rule that the president used executive order was unconstitutional? The president ruled the privacy rights found in the 14th Amendment applied to the president. The Supreme Court ruled that separation of powers doctrine limited the president's use of executive privilege. Or D, the Supreme Court ruled that Congress can proceed with impeachment hearings as defined in the Constitution. And hopefully you guys put C, which is the Supreme Court ruled that separation of powers doctrine limits the president's use of executive privilege. So his powers are limited based on checks and balances under 51.